everyone. Today's project is the cat silhouettes, and I've downloaded these from the internet. I went to suncatcherstudio.com and it took me to a page called 20 cat patterns, and I just downloaded them individually as I like them. And what I did next was run this through my embroidery software. I decided that what I wanted it to have was a little applique stitch around the outside. This made it very quick because it just lays down your placement stitches, and then you have another set of placement stitches for your applique, and then you have your embroidery stitches that are around it, and in this case I used a blanket stitch. The reason I used the blanket stitch was because I find that this gives a nice soft feel to the quilt, whereas sometimes if you're using a satin stitch, although it looks beautiful, it can be a little bit rougher. So, it also takes quite a while to do a satin stitch around a whole design. And that was the reason for doing it this way. My inspiration for this was my daughters. Both of them have cats, and so when I was looking for something that would appeal, I thought that would appeal to both of them. One of the things that I've made in this was I made a couple of test blocks, and after I tested out the designs to see that it was running nicely, I decided to make a couple of placemats also. So I have those here. I have this one, and this one is done in a free motion stitch. And then I also have this one, and this one I've done in straight line stitch with a walking foot. The other thing that I've done with these is I'm currently working on a quilt project where I've taken a whole set of these and I put together a quilt. I have another machine similar to this one, and I've taken it upstairs and put it on my quilting frame. I have a homemade quilting frame, and what that does is it just saves my back and my shoulders from trying to push a whole quilt through the machine. It's the same process. I just turn it to free motion spring action is what I use up there, and put the settings to free motion and then go about the project.
So I'm sitting at the quilt frame, and as you can see, I've got about half of the block that I can do at a time with it on the frame. These blocks finish out at 12 inches, and I can do about 6 inches within the throat space because there's also a good bit of the quilt that's rolled up. It probably looks like it's positioned pretty high as far as at body level for me. But the reason that it's there is because if I am positioned more above it, I can't see what's going on with the needle. I'm outlining each of the silhouettes, and then I'm doing a simple loop design that can be done very quickly. And what your real limitations on something like this are just the speed that your sewing machine can sew. So the goal is to try to be nice and even as I'm going and keep a steady speed and pace. My machine is pretty loud, so a pair of noise-canceling headphones and some good music can go a long way in making this both pleasant and not too damaging to your ears. I also find that the music is really helpful as far as keeping a rhythmic pace while I'm sewing. I have a good amount of machine vibration that transfers to my hands when I'm doing sewing like this, because I'm operating the machine with my hands and moving it around with my hands. So for that reason, it's really good to take frequent breaks. At the end of each row, I have to stop and advance the quilt through the frame, so this gives me a break. I took a couple of pictures of this as I was rolling it off the frame and taking it downstairs for binding.
This I'm very fondly calling the quilt that never ends, because although the patches were really fast to sew up for this, my machine has been, well, it's broken 3 times while I was doing the quilting, so it seems like it's taken forever. So on the back, this is the backing that I've used. I also had to send off for backing for this, so that took a little bit. And I had a lot of excess, as you can see, and I've decided to use this for my binding for the quilt. So I'm just to the point where I'm going to be binding it, and it's going to look like this. So anyway, should be done today.
Here I'm beginning binding, and I'm going to leave a loose flap that's about 12 inches long behind the presser foot. When I come back around, this is going to give me a much larger area than you might think is necessary, where I can join the binding to the other side of the binding. Notice that I've started sewing on the edge of the fabric and not on the corner. So I've turned the corner and I'm coming down the other side. This is where you just want to take your time and reposition your hands frequently as you're doing your sewing. And you want to give your quilt good support because there's going to be the main bulk of it is going to be either resting on your shoulders or in your laps. So here I've come down to the next corner, and you'll notice that I'm marking this with a chalk on a diagonal. What I want to do is sew to the diagonal mark and just stop my needle at the diagonal mark, and then I'm going to turn the fabric and pivot it just a little bit so that I can sew off of the fabric right there. So I want to sew straight off the edge, and then I'm going to cut my thread, and I'm going to turn the fabric, and I will fold back along that diagonal that should be at a 45-degree, and I'll just double the fabric over right there at the edge. I want it to come right up to the edge of the side that I was sewing on, and then I'm going to turn it and start on my next edge. I'm sewing here right at about 1/4 of an inch of a seam allowance. When you've gone around all 4 sides of your fabric and you're back to where you started, it's time to join your binding together. So what I've done here is I've just pressed out a 45-degree diagonal mark there, and I'm pressing it with my fabric, and I'm going to take Elmer's washable school glue. I like this because it doesn't gum up your machine. It's a starch product, and it washes right out of your fabric later. So there's no concerns about either the gumminess of it or the idea that it wouldn't wash out of your fabric. That's the reason I think they use it in schools so often. So you take your school glue and you take your line on the diagonal. Now you take your other flap and you lay it over the glued edge, and after you have it laid there, then you're going to open up the flap. So you've got it laid there, and then you'll pop it over, well, not really pop it, but you'll just lay it over there. You're trying to get it very straight right there, and then you're going to heat press it. This is a pretty strong bond once you heat press it, and it will stay for a long time. Now that I've got this glued, I'm going to snip off the 2 tails, and this is just to give it a little bit easier handling as I'm working on it. So there's no scientific way of how I'm doing that. I'm just taking a little bit off. Now I'm going to press this back down, and I also want to stretch it out. See how it aligns perfectly with the quilt that's down below it. So you know that it's going to lay down perfectly, and I've pressed it down, and I know it's going to line up. I've drawn a chalk line along the glue line that I just pressed down, and now I'm going to sew along that line. This is just a little bit easier for me to see when I'm sewing, and it's easier to see in the camera with the chalk line there. So it's not necessary. You could just make sure that you're kind of going edge to edge between the 2 joints there, and then you're going to pull it up and check and make sure everything lines up again. Now I'm going to trim right at about 1/4 of an inch along the seam line that I just made. So don't judge me too harshly. I just realized that I have some very dull shears that I grabbed, and I just reached down for the first ones that were in my drawer, and it was not easy to cut with them at all. Now I'm going to lay this back out, and I'm just going to double check one more time and make sure everything lays nice and flat there. Now, after I've determined everything is nice and flat, I'm just going to come back and I'm going to finish up this last part of the edge of the quilt. I have this flipped over to the front now, and you can see that the advantage of binding from the back first is that you can see your seam line where you were binding it. And now you can turn your binding over and just lay it down over that seam line, and you don't have to wonder where it is while you're working on the front of your quilt.
The cat quilt is finished, and I have, you can see there's not a whole lot that's showing on this end, but what you're avoiding with this method is anywhere that you might have a double line on showing on the front is now at the back. So all you're seeing is your seam line here. And that's the reason you might choose to quilt or to bind the quilt starting at the back and folding it over into the front instead of the other way.
Each of the blocks for this quilt finish off at 12 inches by 12 inches, and the finished quilt is 6 feet by 6 feet. This makes it a good size quilt to fit on a queen size bed.
So that wraps up what's happened with the cat project this past week. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more compulsive quilting and embroidery videos.